Hello, AP students. I am recording this from the Sleep Inn, no, the Comfort Inn in Rochester, Minnesota. So you know that I travel in style. I think room service, I think I can order saltine crackers and water without ice. So that's where I'm recording this from. All right, so the last thing we need to talk about in this unit is the bureaucracy. So these are the professional government workers in the executive branch. We already talked about the president and the cabinet and some of the most important agencies, but now we're going to talk about the rest of it to wrap up the unit. Now, when we talk about bureaucrats and bureaucracy, a lot of times it conjures up negative images of bean counters, useless government employees, but they really carry out some important functions. And when Congress passes a law and the president signs it into effect, it's a bureaucracy's job to carry out those laws and implement them and create the rules and so forth. So although there are fair criticisms of the red tape and wasteful spending at times, they carry out important functions of our federal government. So there's a definition. You can find that in the book as well. Bureaucrats provide the public services that elected officials authorize, so Congress and the president. And there's also some negative connotations with bureaucrats, the idea that they're not doing important work, maybe they're lazy, they get away with things, but in reality, they're pretty comparable to private sector employees, and actually they have a higher level of education, and they do have codes of behavior they have to follow, and so forth. So where do we find the authorization for the bureaucracy in the Constitution? If you look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, go back to the elastic clause, powers Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution, and so on. Okay, carrying out or executing those powers requires some form of a bureaucracy. And then in Article 2, Section 3, he shall take care that all laws be faithfully executed. So that's dealing with the executive branch and the president. So to carry out the laws faithfully also requires a bureaucracy. Okay, as we go through this, there's some probably bullet points that I'm really not going to talk a whole lot about, so just pause it so that you can take down a few of those details that I don't talk about. Now, we've got workers who are on the federal payroll, but then we've also got shadow bureaucrats. Those are people who actually work in the private sector, but they have contracts with the federal government. So examples of that. Examples of contracting out would be, for example, private prisons. You see this more in the South, where southern states will drop contracts with companies that provide prison housing for convicts. Also, you've got through the Pentagon, the Defense Department, you've got defense contractors. They are also shadow bureaucrats. And governments at all levels will contract out work for building highways, bridges, and so forth with private businesses. Those are all examples of contracting out. Government creates a contract with a private organization to do some sort of work for the federal government. Bureaucracies are not limited to the public sector either. So if you go back to the 1800s, Max Weber, German, talked about the rise of bureaucracies. It divides labor up. You get specialized jobs based on different tasks that must be done. You create hiring systems based on merit. So the more competent you are, the more likely you are to get hired, the more likely you are to get promoted. And there's a hierarchy, a ranking, a vertical chain of command with somebody at the top, like the head of an agency. And then there are standard operating procedures that guide. So if somebody leaves the bureaucracy, the next person who comes in, there is a guide for them for what they're supposed to do in their job. So a bureaucracy is not unique to government. We find it in the private sector, in the business world. Okay, and there's just a graphic organizer of Max Weber's model of bureaucracy. Going back in time, Andrew Jackson was really the king of the spoil system. The spoil system was where your government jobs were handed out based on patronage. So if you were a supporter or a friend of the president handed out jobs in the federal bureaucracy to those people. So the problem with that is you're not necessarily getting people who are qualified for those jobs. Maybe sometimes you do, but most of the times you're not. One of our presidents who was assassinated in the 1800s, James Garfield, was assassinated by a Chicago resident. And the person who assassinated him thought he was owed a job because he had supported, and in his mind, he had helped Garfield get elected. Well, he assassinated Garfield when he did not get that job. So that really brought the issue to the fore at that time. And as a result of that, Garfield's vice president, Chester Alan Arthur, who without question had the best chops, you can see it a little bit in that cartoon of any American president, he helped push through the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which created a merit-based system for hiring federal bureaucrats based on competency and skills. And then later on, 1939, the Hatch Act was passed as well, and that limits bureaucrats from participating in certain campaign political activities so long as they are employed by the federal government. Okay, the size of government. If we're talking about the number of bureaucrats, it's actually shrinking. If we go back 25 years, Bill Clinton made that a priority. He called it reinventing government, and he gave his vice president, Al Gore, the job of spearheading, cutting out waste, cutting out jobs that they thought weren't necessary. That doesn't mean that spending is going down. It's not, the deficit is growing bigger, but the payroll in the federal bureaucracy is actually going down. And that's what it looks like by if we look at the cabinet, you probably could have guessed this, the biggest amount of employees based on cabinet department is in the Defense Department, so over 700,000. Now, if you look at the demographics, the characteristics of who is employed in the federal bureaucracy, it's middle-aged, mostly male, but you can see that's equalizing more than it did in the past, 56-44. Interestingly, not even half are college graduates. And we see it's overwhelmingly white, so almost 70% white, but that's changing because in their hiring practices, one of the criteria that they can use is underrepresented groups. So that will be changing more and more. So looking at the bureaucracy, you've got the president's cabinet, all the different secretaries. You've got the independent regulatory commissions like the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission for the stock market, NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, created under FDR. And you've got government corporations. So a couple of great examples would be the U.S. Postal Service and Amtrak. Those are both still around. And then you've got the independent executive agencies like NASA. Okay, a couple things in the way that we can differentiate different types of bureaucrats. You've got the political appointees, so people who the president has appointed. You've got senior executive service employees, and you've got civil servants. The best jobs in the bureaucracy are listed in something called the Plum Book, and I believe that's where the expression a plum job comes from, meaning a good job to have. The plum jobs are filled through the patronage system, so people who supported the president, those are the ones that the president appoints. And the president can fire them too. Many times they just resign or they retire under pressure. That's what the Plum Book looks like. So by the first half of the 1800s, it was all patronage system, like Andrew Jackson. So 1800 through 1850 patronage system. But again, after Garfield was assassinated, we get the Civil Service Act, and we move towards merit-based, or people with the most qualifications being hired. So then we start to have tests. And you may not know this, but even for the civil service and the postal service, you have to take a civil service exam to show your competency. So even the mail carriers that you see, they had to pass a civil service exam. And they do have increased job protection. Okay, and I talked about this just a second ago, the changing in demographics. We're going to see more and more non-white Americans making up the bureaucracy because ethnicity, race can be used as a factor in hiring between roughly equal candidates. And I mentioned the Hatch Act before, and also that civil servants have some protections, but they can be removed. So if they're doing poor quality of work, if they're not performing their work, or if they're violating the law, like the Hatch Act, where they're engaging in certain political activities that are restricted under that law, they can be removed and fired. The biggest union in the country represents public employees. Private sector labor unions have been declining for decades, but the most powerful and the largest are the ones that represent the civil servants. So it's a little bit different for them because they cannot negotiate salaries or work hours, and they can't strike. You can look at this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is the salary ranges for different bureaucratic positions. Some of them obviously are pretty low, even some of the ones with that require college degrees, like you see right here at this level, the GS7. Okay, there's a couple of these that you can look at. I'm going to skip through this, but if we add up all the bureaucrats in the federal, in the state and local government levels, and then with the shadow bureaucrats, so the people in the private sector that get contracts with the government, you're talking about 13 million of them. So it's a very high number, and the number of federal bureaucrats just adds to that as well. And you can see the growth over time, but it's starting to plateau a little bit over the past 15 or so years. So even though the workforce, the number of bureaucrats at the federal level has started to shrink, federal spending has increased dramatically, even when you adjust it for inflation. So these are the 5 categories of executive branch organizations. You get the departments, so the cabinet, independent administrative agencies, independent regulatory commissions, government corporations, and then the executive office of the president. So it's about 2,000 federal executive branch units and about 4 million federal bureaucrats. And then you got the 15 federal departments making up the cabinet. And the leader of each cabinet department is called a secretary, except for the Justice Department, where it's the Attorney General. Our oldest cabinet departments are State Treasury, War, which is now Defense, and a couple departments that aren't around anymore, the Army and Navy. And then you can see the Interior later on. Our most recent departments would be Veterans Affairs in 1988, and then the most recent is Department of Homeland Security in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks. Okay, a couple of agencies and commissions that I want to point out. Independent regulatory commissions. So these are outside the cabinet, and they create the standards of behavior for specific industries, and then they monitor so that they ensure that those private sector businesses adhere to those standards. And because they're independent regulatory commissions, they are allowed to operate outside of or independently from the president's preferences. So, for example, let's say President Trump wants to ease regulations on toy companies. Let's say he's interested in that. The Consumer Product Safety Commission really isn't affected by President Trump's desires for a relaxation of regulations on the toy industry. They're going to continue to monitor and set standards regardless of what the president says. Same like with the SEC dealing with the stock market, or the Federal Communications Commission. So one of their charges is to regulate the public airwaves. It doesn't matter if President Trump, let's say, is, well, let's use a good example here that would be contemporary. He's got a problem with CNN and some of the other news outlets and what they air. He's not going to be able to pressure the FCC into, let's say, coming down hard on cable news networks or anything like that. Government corporations operate like a private business, and PBS, public broadcasting system, would be a great example of a government corporation. Amtrak, the train service, maybe you've used that before, your family, that is also a government corporation, and they're all directed by a bipartisan board. So they all sell a service, or the Postal Service is the best example. They sell a service or a product, but unlike a private business, they don't have private investors. They're government owned, but they can use private advertising. So PBS, for example, if you ever watch public television, they've started to have, well, they've had it for a while, commercials on there. Okay, the Executive Office of the President, the EOP, these are all the offices and councils that report directly to the President to try to manage the federal bureaucracy. And two examples would be a couple things we've talked about already: the OMB, that helps put together the federal budget, and the National Security Council, who advises the President on foreign affairs. The President can fire the people he appoints to these leadership roles in the bureaucracy. Okay, maybe pause this for a second just to look at this chart, because it's a good illustration of the federal bureaucracy. All right, so why are bureaucrats so important? And this is a really key point to have in your notes. Bureaucrats are active in the process. They set the agenda. They develop policies after Congress passes a law and the president signs it into effect. Those laws don't spell out all the rules that need to be created. Like, let's say with OSHA, that governs the workplace, rules for safety in the workplace. Congress doesn't sit down, even in committee, and iron out all the minute details of how we're going to deal with food safety, for example. That falls on the bureaucracy. So they have to implement, and then they have to evaluate how their policies are being carried out. So do they need to revise things? What do they need to change to make it better for consumers, for the American public? Those types of things. Okay, so elected officials, like members of Congress, they make a decision about what issues they want to discuss and address. Bureaucrats are instrumental in setting the policy agenda. They have a specific set of knowledge and experience, and they can, in those specific areas, they have expertise, so they're indispensable. So bureaucrats have that specialized knowledge, and elected officials, the members of Congress, will go to the bureaucracy when they're trying to formulate policies to get advice. So bureaucrats oftentimes fill in the details for programs, and members of Congress have a broader, vaguer view of what needs to be done. So Congress and the president will, if they decide to vote, so if Congress passes something and the president signs it into law, then you have authorization laws. That sets the plan of action for whatever that issue is, how they're going to address it. Appropriation laws, bills, those are what Congress passes, which state where money will be spent. So the role that bureaucrats play in this budget process is developing an annual budget for their agencies or departments. They are called to the budget hearings in Congress and they try to justify why they need that money. They will lobby Congress, try to influence them so that they spend more money on those agencies or departments. So they're in competition with other agencies. And then finally, the most important thing, they put the policy into action. It's their job to carry it out, to execute it. So for the leaders, the administrators within the bureaucracy, they have discretion about how to best implement the policy. And then Congress will do oversight over that. They'll hold hearings to see, okay, are you really carrying out what we wanted you to do? Then the bureaucracy makes the rules, all the ways that we're going to carry out the intent of Congress and the president through rules, regulations, standards that they set. Then when there are disputes over those rules, sometimes from the general public, they will hold hearings to try and resolve those disputes. So the bureaucracy has to wear many different hats. And then, of course, like I said before, they go back and they evaluate performance. Are those rules, standards being carried out effectively? Or do we need to make changes so that they are more efficient and effective? So there are the steps again in order: agenda setting, policy formulation, policy approval. Then they allocate the resources. And then it's up to the bureaucracy to implement the policy and evaluate it. And the example that you see used here is for the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, after it was passed in 2010. So take a look at that for a second. Okay, some of the notable successes: the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has broadened the vote to new groups who had been denied that right in the past. Some of the debatable ones, we looked at Title IX before, equality in education and higher education. Food and Drug Administration at times has suffered from a lack of resources, and we've had different scares in the news. The CIA, NSA, State Department, we've heard some more about concerns about the CIA, of course, and that whole charge of a deep state, for example, that the Trump administration has spoken of. Okay, and fragmentation. This is where lack of clarity on or overlap between different agencies and departments of who's supposed to be doing what. So sometimes you get restructuring, like we have had in the Department of Homeland Security, a major restructuring. Okay, when it comes to holding the bureaucracy accountable, the idea here is that everybody is watching. So sunshine laws were created to shine the light of day on what the bureaucracy is doing. So based on the idea, and this really goes back to the progressive era, the idea of an open and clean government. So the public having a right to know about what the government is doing and what decisions they're making and how they're doing it. That's what sunshine laws are designed to do. So we've got the Freedom of Information Act. That might be one you've heard before. So documents eventually are released, even in sensitive areas, dealing with, at times, national security issues. Eventually those are released and the public has a right to look at them and access them. Okay, and like I said before, the public does have a right to file suit in a court of law and have a hearing if they think that the actions of a bureaucracy or of a specific bureaucrat have violated their rights as Americans. In policy evaluation, this last bullet point, is an important one. Evaluation of bureaucratic performance can also be required in the authorization legislation by a sunset clause. This sets an expiration date where a program will end or a policy will end unless Congress reauthorizes it. So, in other words, the bureaucracy really has to justify it and demonstrate through data why that policy or rule or that program needs to continue. Okay, and the OMB plays a role here by evaluating the bureaucracy and reporting back to the president. Now, the ways that the president, Congress, and the courts, and even ordinary citizens can hold bureaucrats accountable is through legislation that mandates ethics, right and wrong behavior of bureaucrats, through whistleblowers, so people who are on the inside who speak to the press or report to Congress and talk about something that was going wrong in their agency or department. And then we also have the inspectors general who can investigate out of the executive branch. Iron triangles. Now, the concept here is that you have this interrelationship between the bureaucracy, interest groups, and Congress. And they each have obligations to each other. So, like for the bureaucracy, they provide information to Congress. And then Congress expects that they will, and then then the bureaucracy expects that Congress in return will approve the budget that the agency or the department wants. And interest groups also provide information to the bureaucracy. And in return, what they expect from the bureaucracy is lesser regulations or no regulations or rules that benefit them. And then finally, interest groups to Congress. Well, interest groups provide campaign contributions to members of Congress, and then interest groups expect friendly legislation from Congress. So that's what we mean by an iron triangle. Everybody provides something to one of the other institutions, but then they expect something in return. You can see some of the problems with that, right? So if interest groups expect friendly legislation back from them, maybe that doesn't serve the public interest. Maybe it just serves the interest of that group of businesses that the interest group represents. So with ethics in government, there was a law in 1978 passed that prohibited conflicts of interest by bureaucrats where they're trying to serve the interest of two different entities. So usually it arises when you have a civil servant who can, make a decision like about regulations or rules where they can personally benefit from it. Sometimes it involves a spouse who personally benefits from it, and where there's a clear conflict of interest too, because their spouse is going to, let's say, monetarily benefit from some decision made by the bureaucracy. So that law was meant to try and prevent that. Whistleblowers, like I said, are people who come from the bureaucracy, who disclose to the public, to Congress, some type of abuse or mismanagement or misconduct or waste, and they make it public. So the president can appoint an inspector general who works within one of those departments or agencies to try and monitor these things and investigate any allegations along those lines. So it's a way of policing the bureaucracy. Okay, I'm going to skip that. So what are the characteristics of the bureaucracy that perform well? When an agency or department has clear goals, when it's flexible, when it allows its people, its bureaucrats, to use some discretion rather than just having a flat, not taking into account the circumstances in context. That's not going to work. So you have to give your people flexibility. You have measurable goals, and the mission is of giving rather than taking, right? Okay, so this researcher looked at contracting out. So the government creating contracts with private sector entities to carry out some function. And what he found was it's not always the case that the private sector does a better job than the government. Boy, what's an example I can speak to? I've gotten some really horrible service from FedEx and UPS that really stands out. I haven't found them to be generally better than the U.S. Postal Service, for example. And I can probably come up with some other examples if I think about it. So just saying that government always does things worse, it's really not meted out when you look at studies and even in some of our experiences. Okay, the problem with holding the bureaucracy accountable is how much does the public really know about what the bureaucracy does? Probably very little. But if you are, let's say, a rancher, you probably know a lot about the EPA and their rules and regulations. So in certain areas, you might have quite a bit of knowledge. Or if you're a business owner, you probably know about OSHA and OSHA rules, and you might have some problems with some of the rules and regulations that they create because it creates a financial burden on your business. Okay, so just to review, going back in time, if we go back to the beginning of the Republic, there were 3 departments and there were 2 offices staffed with public servants engaged in mostly clerical work. And the national population was only 4 million people. Now you have 4 million bureaucrats, right? So match the population of the country under Washington. And if you add up all the state and local bureaucrats, you get 13 million, you got 4 million bureaucrats at the federal level. So there's been a growth. But again, remember, comparing that to the beginning, not comparing it to 20 years ago, because the number of bureaucrats has actually gone down, even though we're now up to over 300 million people. Okay, and so as far as other thoughts and questions, so will the best and brightest respond to the call to serve? Bureaucrats in the federal bureaucracy make less than their private sector counterparts who do similar jobs. That can be tough to attract people to government. At the state level, that's really tough because they have cut back, like in the state of Wisconsin, on pensions and things like that. So you're going to see more and more people going to the private sector rather than going into government. A lot of things have been promised by the internet, making information about the bureaucracy open to everybody online, promised big things. It remains to be seen whether that will happen and whether people will really monitor the bureaucracy. Okay, so make sure that you do the Chapter 14 questions after this. It is a little bit shorter than most of the other chapter questions we've had so far, so that's going to be due for Tuesday. Please make sure you get that done. If you have trouble accessing it, let me know, and we'll try and get that fixed. Okay, I will see you back on... Wait, I'm just in my mind here, I'm trying to make sure which days. Okay, so... Yeah, I'll see. Actually, that's Monday. I'm sorry, Monday, that I will see you again, and that's when you should have your Chapter 13 questions, or Chapter 14 questions done. Okay, I'll see you then.